Hi and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to do a debrief of all the books that I read in the month of October. And there were definitely some spooky books on my list, and it was a wonderful reading month. So without further ado, I'm gonna start with the first book I read, which was Stormfront. This is the first book in Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files. And it follows a wizard who does paranormal investigations. This book actually reminded me a lot of the Crescent City series by Sarah J. Maas. It's a lot shorter than that book. This book was around 350 pages. And it has just a bunch of different creatures. There were vampires, there were wizards, and I found it to be kind of a mix of like fantasy and noir, and I enjoyed it. I don't know that I'm gonna read a ton more books in this series just because it didn't like completely suck me in. I listened to this on audio, but I definitely enjoyed it. So if you like kind of a mix of mystery and fantasy, I would definitely check it out. Next, I listened to Unmasked, My Life Solving America's Cold Cases by Paul Holes. And this is actually someone, I didn't realize this, but this is a person, an investigator who shows up in another book that I'm familiar with, which is the book about the Golden State serial killer that McNamara was involved in, the woman who kind of cracked the case or was working on the case, and then she died in the middle of working on her book. And Paul Holes actually worked with her and knew her. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I hadn't realized there was going to be overlap there between that story and his story. He actually covers a lot of different cold cases in this particular book, but he does cover that one as well. This book I found to be kind of an unflinching account of the challenges of being an investigator and getting kind of sucked into cases, and that it affects your family life, it affects your personal life. And definitely if you're someone who's interested in kind of cold case mysteries, this would definitely be something to pick up. Next, I picked up Aaron Sterling's The X Hex, which is the first book in the X Hex series. There are other books that have been added to this series. I listened to this on audio. It was super fun. So this is basically a story about a woman who puts a hex on this person who she breaks up with, and then he shows up in her life years later and he is still kind of hexed, and he's experiencing this hex in this small town where there are a bunch of witches and warlock equivalents, although in this book, male witches are also called witches. And there's also a kind of college in this town that has like a secret major for witches. And I thought it was just really fun. It's a small town, perfect for Halloween reading kind of book. I think it's wonderful to read in the fall, so highly recommend, and would definitely pick up the next book in the series. Then I picked up what is probably one of my favorite books of the month, and it's called TheOne by John Marrs. This is one that I saw a lot of people kind of raving about on Instagram, and so I decided to pick it up. And basically the idea is that this is in a future world where there is a DNA test that you can take, and that DNA test tells you who you're supposed to be matched with romantically. And so this is one of those situations where people are taking this DNA test and some of them are being matched to other people like outside of a relationship they're already in. So you can imagine this is like causing a lot of havoc. And this book basically follows 5 different people who are experiencing their matches in different ways. One of them is a serial killer. One of them is a man who ends up being matched to another man, but he's in a relationship with a woman. One of them is a woman who's matched to someone who lives across the world. You know, there's all these different kinds of situations, and you kind of learn about how these things unfold throughout the course of the book. I loved this. I thought the premise of it was so fascinating. I loved the switching back and forth between the characters of the different chapters. I was able to follow this very easily because of how the author sets up the different lives of the characters. And I also listened to this one on audio and really, really enjoyed it. So highly recommend that one. I also picked up Eliza and Her Monsters by Francesca Zappia, and also really enjoyed this. So I'm loving young adult romances that take place in high school settings. I just think they're so fun. there's a lot of innocence, there's a lot of awkwardness, and this book brings that in as well. So this is basically about a girl named Eliza who creates a webcomic called Monstrous Sea, and it's hugely popular, and she ends up meeting this new boy who comes into her high school, and he is like writing fan fiction about Monstrous Sea, but he doesn't know that she's the creator of Monstrous Sea. And so you basically have two characters who are kind of bonding over the same topic, but he doesn't know the full story of her connection to Monstrous Sea. And yeah, it's just a really charming little book, and I loved it. There's also I listened to it on audio, but I did take a look at the ebook because there's some drawings that get included in the ebook because it's a webcomic. So that was super fun. Then I picked up a nonfiction book called Working Identity, Unconventional Strategies for Reinventing Your Career by Herminia Ibarra. Now, I had read this author in essays because she's written several essays for Harvard Business Review around this concept of career reinvention and pivoting. I think her work is really fascinating. So in this, she basically talks about people who have gone in like very different directions with their careers. Like maybe they worked as like an accountant and then they became like a deep sea fisherman or something along those lines. Like it's just a drastic change. And she studies this. This is her research area. So this is an academic. I thought the book was very approachable. It is rated over 4 stars on average on Goodreads, just to give you a sense. Like it's not just, I think, academics who are finding this book to be interesting. I also rated this book 4 out of 5 stars. I thought it was just like a really interesting kind of collection of stories. And I like when academics and researchers bring real people's stories into their books. So I really enjoyed that. Next up, I read The Cold Vanish, Seeking the Missing in North America's Wildlands by John Billman, another nonfiction read about people who go missing and the people who search for them. This was a really interesting set of narratives of some people who've gone missing and they have never been found and no one knows anything about what happened to them. There are a couple stories we follow throughout this book, and then we do find out what happens to those people who go missing. But typically it's people who are missing like in the woods, like they go hiking and then they're never heard from again. And I thought this author just did an incredible job of telling the stories, especially of family members who are really struggling to find out what happened to their loved ones. And you can tell that he takes a very kind of journalist approach to the topic, but also that he's becoming very connected to the family members that he's writing about. So I found this one to be really interesting as well. Okay, next up I read, as part of my Alphabet Challenge books, In Love, a Memoir of Love and Loss by Amy Bloom. This is the story of the author and she's married to a man who's diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he decides that he wants to end his life. And so they go to Switzerland, where there is a assisted suicide kind of company where you can do this. It's one of the only places in the world where you can do this. And she talks about this journey of him being diagnosed, their life, you know, in between his diagnosis and his death, the story of his death, and then the post kind of aftermath after he takes his own life in this assisted suicide facility in Switzerland. This is a book where I can imagine, for the most part, I'm not typically like a crier with books. So I did not cry with this book, but I can't imagine pretty much anyone else who gets emotional over books, you would get emotional over this book. What a kind of hard situation to go through. And Amy Bloom, I think, just does such a wonderful job of sharing about kind of the ups and downs of this like very emotional journey that she took with her partner. I learned about this book because she had written an essay about it in the New York Times, and then she expanded on it into a memoir. And highly recommend it, but just know it's harrowing. Like it's just a really hard story to read, especially if you are partnered or if you have any kind of background or family history with Alzheimer's. I could imagine this would also be very challenging to read as well. Okay. Then I picked up Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak. This is another book that I had just heard everybody talking about, and so I wanted to know what it was about. This is basically the story of a woman who's working as a nanny for a young boy. She has a history of addiction and drug use, and she's kind of remaking her life. And when she's taking care of this boy, he starts to draw these pictures that are kind of violent, and it just seems kind of odd that he's like drawing these pictures. This is very much kind of a horror-esque story. So if you're someone who likes horror, you might take a look at this. I'm not typically a horror person. I still found this to be interesting. I listened to it on audio. It was very difficult to put down because I really just wanted to know where this was going. And it definitely takes a bit of a twist at the end that you are not thinking is going to happen. Like there are definitely some things that get revealed at the end of this book that I just wasn't expecting. And I always appreciate a book that can kind of trick me in that way. So I really enjoyed that one. Then I picked up The Lost Village by Camilla Sten. This is a book in translation. It takes place in, I want to say in Sweden. I'm just looking really quickly at the description. It's definitely Scandinavian. And basically this is about a group of filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, who are going to this village that at one point in the past had people living in it. And then like overnight, they just all disappeared. And the author kind of lays out, I think in like a foreword to the book, that this is about kind of women in various stages of mental illness and kind of how they've been treated historically. So I kind of like knew going in that that was a little bit about what this book was about. There's a woman who remains in this abandoned village who was stoned to death. And there's also a newborn that's found. And there's just all this mystery that surrounds what happened. This was very much kind of like a Blair Witch Project kind of story, if you're familiar with that film. Where you have kind of these documentarians trying to figure out what's going on. I really liked it. I also had a hard time kind of putting this down. I read it again on audio, and so it's very kind of atmospheric and another great kind of spooky read for this time of year. Okay, then I picked up a book that was not on my original TBR pile. It is called The Highly Sensitive Person by Elaine Aron. And I had heard about this book. I mean, I was familiar with it. I knew about this concept of the highly sensitive person. And I had come into contact with this concept because I coach people, and some of the people I coach identify as highly sensitive people. This is not something that in the past I had identified with, but I kind of stumbled across it again. And I was like, okay, I'm going to look into this because I have some clients who fall into this category. Well, Elaine Aron has a quiz on her website that you can take. And so if you just Google highly sensitive person, you're going to come up with this website and you'll find this quiz. So of course I take the quiz and I score really high on this quiz, which I wasn't expecting. But basically what this book is about is this kind of population of people that Elaine Aron has identified that are called highly sensitive people. It overlaps a lot with introverts, but not completely. So about 70% of people who are highly sensitive people are also introverted, but that means 30% of highly sensitive people are also extroverted. And this is also a category that can be confused with shyness, but it doesn't necessarily overlap with shyness. It's basically people who are impacted more than usual by noise, by like sensory experiences that they might take in more than other people. They talk about in this book that you really need time alone, like you're gonna really need solitude time, recovery time as a highly sensitive person. You may have a really strong imagination, vivid dreams, you're highly empathetic to other people. So if this is kind of intriguing to you as a concept, I would definitely pick up this book. I didn't feel like, this is a book that was written, I think, like 25 years ago. While I found it to be really interesting, I did feel like I had to do a lot of translation with the author's examples. And so I would definitely be looking for like other sources of information about this topic. But this is kind of the canonical book about highly sensitive people, if you want to kind of do a deeper dive into this topic. I don't know that I would like highly recommend this book. There are also other books about highly sensitive parents, people who are highly sensitive being in relationships, you know, like there's a lot of literature about this now. But I do think it's helpful to kind of start with this author, just so you kind of have an awareness of like where this began. But I'm also going to do kind of a deeper dive into other literature that I find in this area, just because I find it interesting. Okay, next up, I read The Chestnut Man by Soren Sveistrup, and I thought this book was so fun. It has, and I think this has been made into like a Netflix series, which I have not watched yet, but I found this book to be so interesting. So this is the same person who was the creator of the Scandinavian television show The Killing. So if you're familiar with that, which I also loved, I watched that in its original, and I think it had an adaptation as well. And basically this is about a man who is killing people and then leaving like these little chestnut men. And he kills someone, and the chestnut man that's left behind has the fingerprint of a young girl who was kidnapped, and she happens to be the daughter of a government minister. And they thought she was gone. They thought she was dead. The person who supposedly killed her was arrested and put in prison, and yet they're finding this chestnut doll that has her fingerprint on it. And so they're trying to figure out what's going on because her body was never found. And so there's kind of this question about like what's happened with this. So it's kind of got like a cold case element to it. It's got a present day serial killer element to it. And then there's a couple of cops who are trying to kind of follow this and figure out what's happening. This was a relatively long book, if I remember. Yeah, like 500 pages. But short, quick chapters. So you're just like really very speedily going through this narrative. I listened to this on audio and kind of alternated between that and the ebook. Really enjoyed it. Super fast paced, really interesting. And I liked kind of the twists and turns in that one. Next up, I picked up In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. This was another Alphabet Challenge book that I had on my list. And it's basically, if you've heard of the subgenre of dark academia, this would fall into this category. It's a bunch of friends who were in college together. One of their friends was killed while they were in college. They've all gone about their lives, and then they're coming back for like a kind of college reunion. And all of these kinds of layers start to unveil what actually happened when they were in college together and this person died. There is a main character who we're following, a woman named Jessica Miller, and she also has kind of a bit of a, like, you're not sure if you can trust her as a narrator. So there's like layers about that as well. Listen to this on audio. If you like dark academia, I would recommend this. I thought it was pretty well done. Okay, next up, I read The Other People by C.J. Tudor. This is an author that I've read before, really enjoyed. And basically, this is a story about a man who's driving home one night, and he, in the car in front of him, he sees what he thinks is his daughter, like out the back window of the car. And then when he gets home, he finds out that his wife and daughter have been murdered. But because he saw his daughter in this car, isn't sure, like he kind of questions the fact that his daughter was murdered, or he's kind of questioning himself, like what did he see, because apparently his daughter was dead, but he sees her in this car, and he's trying to figure out what happened. He ends up going into kind of the dark web and connecting with people who are also trying to figure out, you know, various things that have happened to their family members. And this was one of these books that it's kind of unbelievable. You just have to kind of like follow it and release some of your understanding of reality a little bit, just because it gets to be a little bit like far-fetched in terms of where the plot goes. But I actually also really like this one. I thought it was fast-paced. I didn't really see where it was going in the end. There were a lot of connections that like were introduced in the beginning and then they mean something different later on in the book. So would also recommend that one too. All right, then I picked up the next book in the Armand Gamache series by Louise Penny called Kingdom of the Blind. And this is a series that I've had a hard time talking about because the further you go in the series, there's various events that happen that even giving away small things about the plot would give away spoilers. But at a high level, there are three people who are brought together. Gamache is one of them. Another one is a woman who's in the Three Pines town that he lives in. And they're brought together as like executors of a will to somebody that they don't know. And so they're not really sure why those three people have been brought together to be executors of this will. And they're trying to kind of figure out what the connection is that has allowed for that. So that's kind of a high level. that's a pretty standard kind of plot for this series, is that you have just kind of a mystery that's introduced very early on, and then layers are kind of peeled away throughout the story so that you understand, you know, why this came together. And another solid entry into this particular series. Okay, next up, I picked up The Friend Zone by Abby Jimenez. This is book 1 in a 3-book series called The Friend Zone. I had read the other 2 books in the series first, so I went back to the original one, and I have to say I'm kind of glad that I read them in this order. Normally I would not say that, but the second book is kind of the love story of a woman who goes through a very traumatic experience in book 1. And having read the second book, I like knew that she was going to be okay. And I appreciated that. I mean, I kind of knowing, because in this book, it's like a very difficult thing happens. And I was just like kind of heartbroken by it. But then I remembered like, oh, but she's okay because of what happens in book 2. But basically this is about a woman who is facing a medical procedure that might mean that she can't have children. And when she's kind of going through the decision-making process about this, she meets and falls in love with someone who clearly wants to have children. And he doesn't know that this is her situation. So she's putting up all these kinds of walls and barriers to not be with this person, but she's in love with him and he's in love with her. And eventually he finds out, you know, that this is what's going on, and they have this kind of dramatic kind of breakup, and it's like you're trying to figure out if they're going to stay together. And in the midst of that, she has her best friend who's getting married, and this best friend is the person who shows up in book 2. So I really like this series. I really like Abby Jimenez. I've talked about her before. I just really enjoy her books. I think she does a great job with contemporary romance. Okay, after that, I picked up book 9 in the Robert Jordan Wheel of Time series called Winter's Heart. And this is another series. I read book 9. I also read book 10, Crossroads of Twilight. I'm trying to read 2 books a month now to get to the end of this series by the end of the year. Super hard to talk about without giving away just massive spoilers. Really after like books 1, 2, and 3, there's not a whole lot that I can say. I will say that this series is a massive investment of time in particular. And I would not recommend this series unless you are like a deep fantasy person. You like high fantasy, or you like to do like long investments in series. Like you really have to commit, or you're not gonna go all the way to the end of this thing. It has helped me a ton that my partner knows this series in and out, and so I can ask questions. I also have like a reader's companion to this series, so I can understand more deeply what's going on. So just know, it's kind of like taking a college class on this particular series when you decide to invest in it, because it's hard to understand unless you're gonna like really make the commitment. Okay, next up, I picked up on audio The Long Game, How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World by Dory Clark. This is actually a book, it wasn't on my list originally for the month, but I really wanted to read this. I really like Dory Clark's work. I've read several of her other books before. She's a frequent contributor to Harvard Business Review and various other things that I read. Basically what this book is about is that you can make significant investments in your life and your career that take a while to pan out. And I have found that to be so true in my own life and my own career that I loved kind of reading about this and telling different stories and strategies for how you can basically like plant a seed and then have faith that it's going to grow over a period of time. Highly recommend this. Really enjoyed the examples that she brought into this particular book. Okay, at this point in the month, I had a few books left to go, and they were all my Alphabet Challenge books. And okay, first of all, I Am Pilgrim. This book is over 600 pages long. I pick out these Alphabet Challenge books without looking at the page length, which is sometimes a mistake, but I really, really enjoyed this book. I did eventually find it on audio, and I'm really glad that I did. Fast-paced thriller, international story. Basically, you have all these kinds of like stories being woven in and out of each other. I really read this book as if it was like a movie. I immediately looked up to see if this had been optioned for film, and it has been. It hasn't been made yet, but I was just not surprised at all that this would be made into a film, because it's very cinematic in the very short chapters, different stories kind of weaving in and out of each other. But basically you have someone who's like a former person who worked for a CIA-esque entity, but not the CIA, more of like a secret organization. And he gets pulled into a series of events because of his past where they're trying to kind of solve a crime. It's definitely like a racing against a clock kind of story where he's trying to kind of like put a bunch of pieces together so he can stop this like world-wrecking situation from happening. What I will say is within the first 2 chapters of this book, there is a very graphic scene. And if you don't like that scene, you might not want to read the rest of the book. Like I felt like that was actually one of the more graphic scenes that shows up like within the first 2 chapters. It's violent, it's sexual, but it doesn't really, there's not a ton more of that in the rest of the book, but there is some. And so if you are reading the first couple chapters, like I read them and I thought, I'm not sure I want to keep going. Like I was a little bit on the edge for me, but I kept going and I'm glad I did. So I would just say you might give it like, I don't know, 50 to 100 pages to see kind of how you're feeling about it. If you're someone who doesn't really like that kind of graphic stuff. Okay, then as kind of a palate cleanser, I picked up Judy Blume's In the Unlikely Event. Now, this is a really interesting book. It is fiction, but it's based on like a real life situation that happened in a town where there were multiple plane crashes in a very short period of time. And she basically places the story of this book in this town. There's 3 generations of families that are kind of engaging in this town over time. It's very much kind of a coming of age story. I really wanted to like this book, but I will say, I listened to it on audio, I found it a little bit boring at times. I don't know exactly why. I'm very intrigued by this concept of placing the book where it's placed, you know, in terms of the history of these plane crashes, but I just wasn't really sucked into any of the characters' stories. I do note that it has like a 3.5-star average review on Goodreads, so I don't think I'm the only one. I ended up rating this like 3 out of 5 stars. But it's well done. It's just not, I don't know, I didn't find it to be super compelling. So take that for what it's worth if you want to pick that one up and try it out. Okay, the last book that I read this month, Wally Lambs, I Know This Much Is True. When I picked this book out for my alphabet challenge, I did not realize it's 900 pages long. I also did not realize it is not available on audio except as an abridged version, which in my mind is cheating. And so I would not listen to the abridged audio. So I read every single word of this book, every single word of this 900 pages. I started it relatively early in the month just so I could start like chipping away at it because I knew it would take me a while. But in the last couple days of the month, I was like binge reading this, trying to get through it. This is the story of a man who he's a twin brother. His name is Dominic. His twin brother's name is Thomas. And in the very early chapters of the story, his twin brother, who is a paranoid schizophrenic, cuts off his hand in a public library. And this starts one of the storylines of the book, which is basically Dominic advocating for his brother Thomas, who is being put in kind of a mental institution and being treated for his paranoid schizophrenia. There are many layers to this book. At one point, there is a story within a story within a story that's being told in this book. This may not surprise you because it's 900 pages long. I found it to be incredibly compelling. I was like turning the pages. I really enjoyed the book. I did find it to be, there were elements, you know, in any story like this where you have like multiple storylines, there's some that you're going to like more than others. So there were certain storylines where I was like, okay, I'd like to get through this so that I can get back to this other storyline and kind of understand what's happening. But basically it's the story of, at one point, Dominic compares himself to Job, the story from the Bible about this man who's kind of being put upon and put upon and put upon. And you do at a point in this book just think like, is this going to turn out okay for Dominic? Like, we're not sure because he's just dealing with a lot of stuff with his family, with his history. He's throughout the book trying to find out who his real father is. Like, there's just all these layers. And I found the book to be incredibly satisfying in terms of how it wraps up. I found it to be a little bit heartbreaking because of what's happening with his brother. I would say there are trigger warnings here for child abuse, for child sexual abuse, for mental health, for abuse of adults who are in mental health situations. I mean, like there were a lot of things going on here So just kind of know that going in, that there are aspects of this book that are very heavy, but I would absolutely pick up another Wally Lamb. I've read his other stuff before and really enjoyed it. I can see why this book in particular was made into like a series. I can't remember where it was, like Amazon Prime or Apple Plus, or it's somewhere where they've kind of adapted this into a series. And I can see why, because there's just all these really incredible layers to it. So would highly recommend it with a few caveats about trigger warnings, depending on how you approach those. So those are the 22 books that I read in October. A ton of really amazing reading that I would highly recommend. And keep an eye out soon, because I'm going to be sharing the next books that I have coming up in November. As we're getting closer and closer to the end of this year, I'm feeling more confident that I can continue to read 22 books in each month of the year of 2022. So keep an eye out for that November TBR video. And until then, happy reading.